now it's time to introduce our speaker. Okay, so Aino Pihlak is a visiting PhD student from the University of Toronto, also known as U of T. She is a trans woman and an emerging social historian who studies past articulations of trans feminine existence. In addition to her interest in trans feminine porn studies, she is a scholar of 20th century Anglophone and overwhelmingly white trans feminine subcultural periodical networks. She hopes her analysis of the complexities and messiness of past, and I'd say present trans lives also, honors those who build the path that she now walks on. And so the title of the talk is Putting the Femme in Feminist, Transfeminism and the quote-unquote male lesbian in the American Second Wave. So please join me in introducing Aino Pihlak.
Good afternoon to those of us in the room. Good morning, good evening to those on Zoom or watching this back later. Thank you to Dr. DeVore and all who make up the Trans Chair and its archive for having me. Before I began my doctorate at the University of Toronto, I completed my master's here at UVic. And I chose UVic largely due to the Trans Archive being here. Among so many other benefits, trans archives and wider socio-intellectual institutions like the Trans Chair, Nacho Nights, provide nourishment to the soul, literal nourishment too, especially in a time of ever-ascendant trans-misogynistic and transphobic fascism. On that note of protecting one's peace, as you may have guessed from the talk's title, I'm going to be saying a great many trans-misogynistic, transphobic, and homophobic slurs and otherwise outdated historical language in this talk. So please protect your peace if need be. What is a male lesbian? A slur? A post-structuralist thought experiment to prove the impossibility of transsexual womanhood? A minor season 1 L-word character? A crunchy term, right? For the oftentimes imbricated butch trans-masc identities and subcultures. Well, the answer to my initial question invites a further question. What was the feminist second wave, if there even was one? For many scholars, feminists, and people, when posed the question, what was second wave feminism? They start their answer with the year, 1977. It's a great year if you want to tell a history of trans-misogynistic feminism. In 1973, a minority of radical feminists at the West Coast Lesbian Conference protested the involvement of transsexual lesbian Beth Elliott, which motivated Robin Morgan to include vitriolic trans-misogynistic tropes in her conference keynote the next day. In 1973, the same year, trans-misogynistic lesbian feminist Sean O'Leary forced trans-feminine revolutionary icon Sylvia Rivera off the stage of a Christopher Street Liberation Day rally. Yet, 1973 was also when a social club that specialized in bringing, quote, she-males openly together with bisexual and feminist women, end quote, hosted another popular gala spring ball. Perhaps hundreds of trans femmes and their admirers from amongst the broader self-identified feminist community attended the San Francisco Bay extravaganza. And across the country, hundreds more were members of the social society made up of, quote, all those feminine persons of whatever genetic sex or sexual persuasion who desire to meet other feminine individuals. The Salmacis Society was the name of this organization, and throughout its decades of existence, from 1971 to 1984, and from 1986 to sometime in the early 2000s, a distinctly sex-positive, utopic feminist ethos underpinned this nationwide organization by and for lesbian and bisexual trans femmes. My talk today, based off a forthcoming Gender and History article, co-written with my frequent collaborator and dear friend Emily Cousins, is based off this article. For those who would like to read an early open access release of the co-authored article I'm basing this talk on, please scan the QR code on this slide and others throughout. But before Dr. Cousins and I researched this article, before I had even met them, I, like perhaps some of us here in this very room, was of the incorrect view of the second wave feminism as just TERFs and racist, despite reality. I remember, as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed first-year master's student at UVic, I remember after acknowledging the work of Angela Davis and the Combahee River Collective, I made some dismissive remark about second wave feminism as nothing but TERFs. And I was dead wrong. My then supervisor, Dr. Rachel Hope Cleaves, showed me Finn Enke's great article, Collective Memory and the Trans-Feminist 1970s, which helped change my wayward views. In it, Enke establishes the surprising trans acceptance or solidarity at some of the most infamous moments of the transmisogyny of second wave feminism. Second wave feminist events, and these moments that folks continue to view as constitutive of the entire second wave of North American feminism. And so, I read other scholastic works by Emma Heaney, Williams, and others, which further spoke against this incorrect and totalizing yet popular narrative of the second wave. While I read some of these works, I became a supposed historical expert on 20th century overwhelmingly white Anglosphere trans feminine subcultures. I gave lectures, I published an article, and I wrote a thesis on trans feminine subcultural communities. For the thesis, I read over 500 issues, thousands of pages, of trans femme magazines produced from 1960 to 1995 that crisscrossed America, Britain, Australia, Eritrea, also known as New Zealand, and South Africa. Though I saw the occasional reference to a male lesbian or Salmacis Society, I did not research what either was. I did not know what a male lesbian was. And I should. We all should. Both the Salmacis Society itself and the male lesbian identity formation it mobilized are a significant contribution to recent histories, which have taken up Finn Enke's injunction to offer more mixed up histories of 1970s feminism in place of well-worn narratives of trans women's exclusion. As an earnestly embodied, though historically undocumented vernacular identity, the male lesbian is a fascinating example of 1970s trans lesbian feminist political intellectual theorization. As well, the literature and lifestyles which accompany this onto-epistemology suggest that the organization and its members advance some of the most explicitly sex-positive, trans, femme-centric feminist philosophies to have found their way into print in the second half of the 20th century. The organization's flyers define their understandings of lesbian and feminism that will qualify one for being a Salmacis girl as follows, quote, "If you feel feminine, appear feminine, act feminine, if you are interested in being feminine with another femme, if you believe in the basic feminine, it's hard, feminist, if you believe in the basic basic freedom of the feminine individual, finally, quote, then Salmacis the organization for you, as, quote, the only national, social, and educational organization in the country that is totally equalitarian, regardless of apparent genetic sexuality, end quote. Salmacis established flourishing social spaces where cis and trans lesbians could come together for social and sexual intercourse. In creating these spaces and establishing new ways for its members to live and love in their bodies, the organization upended hegemonic distinctions between sex, gender, and sexuality, and advanced, to adopt Emma Heaney's phrase, a femme-inism against cisness, wherein femme, self-stylization, and identification are the basis for political and social organization. A circa 1972 glossary defined a feminist as, quote, pro-feminine, organized activity on behalf of women's interests, the theory of social equality of the sexes, end quote. That to be a feminist is to be pro-feminine, and this is inseparable from feminism's activist and theoretical dimensions, offers a distinct political vision to which femme is the theory and the practice. To illuminate the herstory of Salmacis and the second wave is an intervention designed to speak to the overlapping second waves of trans liberation and women's liberation that were taking place in this moment, as well as to signal a corrective to associations of second wave feminism exclusively with trans exclusionarity. Though there has been an increase in scholastic attention to the presence of trans women in second wave feminism, the male lesbian as a historically specific trans feminine identity formation remains curiously absent from these discussions. Though there are fleeting asides to Salmacis in discussions of mid-century trans social organizations by Nicholas Matt and Miss Bob Davis, and brief anecdotes within larger trans feminine oral histories, the organization is effectively absent from trans historiography. So too then, the history of Salmacis also complicates historiographies of transvestite organizing in the second half of the 20th century, currently governed by the, currently governed by the binarized documented existence of liberal closeted crossdressers and versus revolutionary street queens. At the intersection of histories of sex-positive feminism, liberal feminism, and liberal transvestite transsexual organizing, Salmacis reminds us of the overlapping investments in world-making and world-building epistemologies that characterize much of 1970s trans organizing. And it offers insights into the prefigurative projects and intellectual demands that trans social organizations advanced in this era. Yet, let's not overcorrect or ignore critical nuance and context. While definitive demographics of the organization's members are unknown and to some level unknowable, there are enough plausible indicators that most male lesbians and Salmacis members were white and middle class. As an identity that's centered on an imbricated sexuality and gender, the absence of explicit reference to race reflects, as it so often does, an unmarked whiteness. These demographic elisions, obfuscations, were likely built into Salmacis members' conceptualizations of femininity and proper femininity, as one may note in the organization's thinly veiled racist and classist centering of sophistication and stature amongst its members. Furthermore, despite the organization frequently putting out flyers based on sex worker erotic imaginings and aesthetics, the eroticized view of the courtesan, etc., the organization seemingly, given the paucity of a source space, but seemingly did not care about actual sex workers' material conditions or the decriminalization of sex work, which remains an urgent issue. In addition, the money needed to participate in the society's costly social events and its focus on femmes would have constituted a further barrier for even those working class drag queens, a trans feminine identity category at the time, working class drag queens who did feel themselves interpolated within its ideals. To say nothing of butches and trans masks within the organization's celebration, lionization perhaps, of feminists and femme for femme erotics. With these caveats in mind, at minimum, the male lesbian was a highly significant pre-internet trans femme identity formation which indexed a proto-queer, sex-positive, femme celebratory, and radical feminist presence in a period of feminism that is rarely historicized as any of these things. As a community that developed a vital philosophy of femme-inism, Salmacis is politically and theoretically valuable today. To demonstrate this point, I divided my talk into two parts. First, contextualizing the Salmacis Society and its wider sociocultural milieu before turning to the actual ontological category. Ontology is just basically being, theories of being, of the male lesbian and its wider trans feminine feminist philosophical milieu. Sally Douglas, herself a San Francisco Bay Area male lesbian, started the Salmacis Society in 1971. She did so after years developing and lecturing to queer, or what we might understand as queer, audiences on her philosophy of male lesbianism, a term that, keep in mind, avoided associations with trans, which some gender nonconforming people of the time regarded as an unfortunate medical prefix. For that reason, many also prefer the term male woman over trans woman. Douglas moved through the area's queer, feminist, countercultural, swinger, and trans feminine circles, and society reflected these diverse milieus. Douglas established the group out of frustration that despite the, quote, almost endless list of existing organizations, end quote, for transvestites, there were none that facilitated romantic and or sexual connections between trans feminine people and femme-loving non-trans women. To stop down for a second, one of the things that I most love about being a trans historian is seeing echoes of my contemporary trans community and those I'm in community with reflected in the archive. But trans terms and notions of trans community, even 10 years ago, to say nothing of 50 years, can oftentimes be rather opaque, if not counterintuitive. So here's a quick history lesson to help contextualize the terms I will use throughout the talk and to explain the endless list Douglas refers to. This is very much an oversimplification. Intermittently since the early 1900s, small groups of trans femmes, typically transvestites assigned male at birth, and sometimes transsexual women, gather together and form social clubs and groups who publish small, bespoke newsletters or pamphlets. Sometimes folks ask me if these are like zines, I guess. To generalize, transvestites, also sometimes not known as cross-dressers, were trans femmes whose trans feminine expression was liminal. It was temporary, at least outwardly. One would dress and or be femme only at certain times and for a range of reasons. In 1952, one of these trans femme groups, a collection of self-described heterosexual cross-dressers in Long Beach, put out 2 issues of a mimeograph newsletter titled Transvestia, Journal of the American Society for Equality in Dress. One of these trans femmes was Virginia Prince. In 1960, Virginia Prince launched her iteration of Transvestia. I believe this is the TransShares copy as well. Transvestia, which was the second iteration, but it's oftentimes misidentified as the first. It was certainly the much more long-running and more widely spread, though. From the first issue, Prince was very specific in how she conceived of trans femininity. For her, transsexual women, in this context, a trans woman who had obtained vaginoplasty, did so because they were greedy and wished to get rich through sex work, or they wanted to have an excuse to have gay sex, aka sleep with men. But she would say that for a rare few, it was for legitimate reasons. For Prince, a true transvestite was a heterosexual one, and heterosexuality meant a trans femme sleeping with a non-trans woman, preferably one's wife. Prince excluded homosexuals from her periodical and its eventual network of sororities. For Prince and countless other subculture members, please feel free. For Prince and countless other subculture members, homosexuality meant any attraction to or sexual relations with men. While Prince applied her homophobia to transsexuals, most members did not. If one was a transvestite, cross-dresser, or male lesbian, it was gay to sleep with a man. In addition, Prince and most of those influenced by her were oftentimes deeply suspicious or against any trans femme who dressed sexy. For a trans femme to dress seductively was abhorred, no matter the intended audience. Despite her narrow respectability-informed viewpoint, Prince and her run of Transvestia helped spark the growth of an overwhelmingly white, trans feminine periodical network that soon latticed the United States, into Canada, and onward. And she remains a controversial figure within trans history, as she was very much a successful architect of this network. Though the subculture's guiding light for much of the 1960s and 70s, Prince and her acolytes were not the entirety of this network. And while most of these magazines were also heterosexual, recalling how the subculture understood the term, many were not. By the mid-1960s, we start getting much more mass-market trans femme erotica or pornography. And what's more, we start getting what we may think of as gay trans feminine subcultural periodicals. By gay trans feminine, again, a term they did not use for themselves, but by gay trans feminine, one can think of the TV show Pose, the movie Paris is Burning, The Balls, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, perhaps. These were drag queens, fairies, hair fairies, hormone queens. They had sex with men, oftentimes understood themselves as gay, and moved through imbricated, faggy, feminine, effeminate worlds. Seen here is one of the most popular periodicals, Drag, where the preceding pictures came from. With some exceptions, the gay trans feminine subcultures were seemingly more clued into radical countercultural politics, gay liberation, of course, and some strains of feminism. And that's how we first learned of the male lesbian in 1972. Sally Douglas chose to introduce the now one-year-old Salmacis to the trans feminine world, an issue of the radical gay trans liberationist periodical Drag. In a bombastic article, Douglas trumpeted how Salmacis provided an atmosphere, quote, where any feminine person, male or female, could feel comfortable, meaning other feminine people, male or female. She went on to say that currently the only requirement for joining Salmacis is a strong pro-feminine interest, but attendance at social functions is usually limited in that males must be feminine in appearance and deportment, at least while the meeting is going on, end quote. Lest a 2-year interruption for at least the next 30 years, the society exemplified this ethos, at least on paper. Salmacis had a documented organizational presence until at least the mid-2000s, and I can get into how I was able to sort of trace that in the Q&A, but this makes it one of the longest-running lesbian social organizations in the global north. It was also one of the more geographically widespread lesbian feminist organizations for the period, commonly historicized as the Second Wave, with more chapters, seemingly, than the Venerable Daughters of Bilitis. Though its core was the Bay Area, Salmacis had a vast network of formal and affiliated chapters and groups. The San Francisco Bay chapter contained 4 sections: the Peninsula, San Jose, San Francisco proper, and East Bay section. There was a Northern California chapter based out of Sacramento, Stockton, a joint Glendale, Los Angeles chapter, potentially Canadian chapters, and confirmed chapters in Detroit, Boston, Chicago, Hartford, New York City, Albany, and Cleveland. And though I can't get it into the gender and history article, I was researching something else and I came across a reference to a potential Italian chapter, which could have just been one woman, admittedly. So after the organization's slow demise over the 1970s, it relaunched in 1986 with a long-running group in Eugene, Oregon as well. In addition to formal chapters, there were trans groups that Douglas claimed as Salmacis affiliates. These included the Honolulu TVTS group, TVTS referring to this trans femme network's largest identity formations of transvestites and transsexuals. Douglas also claimed as affiliates the New Jersey-based United Transvestite and Transsexual Society and the Baltimore, Washington, D.C.-based International Alliance for Male Feminism. Lacking either the ideological desire or communication infrastructure to permit a controlling centralized structure, local chapters varied in their fervor to the male lesbian ideal, organizational structure, and social calendar of group events. For one example, myself and Emily conducted 3 oral history interviews with former members, and Eden, pictured here, spoke about the presence of a trans man in her Stockdale chapter. This is despite, or perhaps in a context, where Salmacis focused overwhelmingly on celebrating femmes. In addition, each of the trans women elders that we spoke with pronounced Salmacis differently, further speaking to the lack of robust, non-text inter-chapter communication. So with undoubtable regional variation, to generalize, those who attended Salmacis events could look to find trans community, information sharing, along with romantic and sexual possibilities, at meetings, galas, balls, or through engagement with the personal ads found in the organization's publications. Though we lack robust sources on these chapters to speak how closely they match the mother chapter and its ideals, at minimum, people in these chapters knew of the society, and their opinion on it was enough, for whatever reason, to desire formal affiliation. So Salmacis did have a geographic breadth, albeit to major cities, but the original San Francisco chapter was by far the largest, and it left the most traces in the historical archive. The San Francisco's proper section hosted 2 open socials each month, backed by, quote, regular and aggressive advertising campaign that was designed to encourage new, interested femmes to come and get acquainted with members and their guests, end quote. By 1975, the chapter's extravagant galas in the Bay Area boasted around 200 attendees. In addition to socials and galas, the Bay chapter held its meetings in bars under the Tavern Guild purview. The Tavern Guild was a business organization of gay and lesbian bars, though overwhelmingly gay, lesbian bars in San Francisco. In a widely printed 1972 flyer, the society trumpeted the bars and other venues where it hosted events were, quote, all members of the Tavern Guild, so there's very little likelihood that any femme will be harassed by any straight person, end quote. The embrace of gender non-normativity and the disparaging of the straight world marks an important contrast to the straight transvestite culture I spoke about earlier. These straight transvestite groups were similarly seemingly white and middle class like Salmacis members, but critically, straight transvestite groups oftentimes, but not always, keenly distanced themselves from any hint of queerness. The fact Salmacis trumpeted holding events with the Gay and Lesbian Tavern Guild's seal of approval, I think that's quite important. Ironically, given their disparagement of masculinity, Salmacis in the Bay Area more closely resembled the bar culture of butch femme working-class lesbians in the preceding decades than the discrete private world of middle-class transvestite societies. Salmacis' lesbianism was lived as a sexually open, public, and unapologetically non-normative identity. As a testament to this, in 1975, amidst the supposed blossoming of trans misogyny in lesbian milieus, the San Francisco chapter began to host all but its largest galas in La Cave. La Cave, great name for a lesbian bar. Lesbian bar in the area. To reach geographically dispersed male lesbians, including those not living in urban centers, Sally Douglas and other members frequently authored columns and placed advertisements for the group in a dizzying array of ideologically and geographically disparate publications. As befit Douglas's love of swinging and the idealized male lesbian's sexually rambunctious nature, Douglas wrote into the swinger publications Singles Press and the Players magazine. She appeared in Drag and Kathy Slavic's many trans feminine periodicals on the West Coast, and the Society appeared in transmasculine publications in America, in Jude Patton's Renaissance, and in Canada, Rupert Raj's short-lived Gender Review. Within the feminist lesbian press, Salmacis members, though primarily Douglas, wrote letters and placed ads in newspapers like the Lesbian Tide and Lavender Woman. Along with the early bisexual work, the Equalitarian Feminist, a journal for the bisexual, bisexual liberated woman. Salmacis apparently helped to fund this last journal too. Members, and those influenced by Salmacis, also placed ads and wrote into radical newspapers like the Los Angeles Free Press, Berkeley Barb, and San Francisco Bay Guardian, along with predominantly gay male periodicals like the Gay Liberator and Gay Community News. Periodical networks were a central mechanism for community formation in this pre-internet era, and a small group of Salmacis members led by Douglas passionately trumpeted the concept of the male lesbian to catalyze and convert trans femmes across North America. The outgoing organizational nature of Salmacis extended to an amorous ethos of interpersonal outreach. Douglas and other Salmacis writers consistently advised other trans femmes across the country to put themselves out there for both sexual liaisons and to raise the visibility of, their words, feminized males. In the case of the former, Salmacis newsletters advised trans femmes in areas currently not served by a chapter that women, by this they mean non-trans women, likely attracted to trans femmes are those, quote, who are active in the femme-lib movement, women who are bisexual, and women who think of themselves as gay or lesbian, end quote. And the best way to be approached by them, besides cruising lesbian bars, will be to place personal ads in, quote, feminist, gay, or underground papers, end quote. This understanding, based on experience in San Francisco, that cis women who are queer and or in the feminist liberation movement would be the most obvious friends and lovers of Salmacis trans femmes, evidences a history of trans and cis lesbian feminist organizing, currently undocumented, which extended beyond solidarity to deeply shared communities and romantic relationships. Indeed, in 1981, when then radical lesbian feminist Patrick Khalifa asked one of the members of the founders of the Daughters of Bilitis, Phyllis Leon, for the information of a Bay Area trans group, Leon responded, quote, I understand Salmacis is not functioning, end quote. While Leon was in fact mistaken, as the chapter's hiatus came a year or so later, this one line, penned in a short letter, is, at least to me, a revelation. That one of the original founders of the veritable lesbian organization, the Daughters of Bilitis, explicitly references the Salmacis Society and knew enough of its workings to believe that it had closed, demonstrates a surprising level of reciprocal awareness across supposedly disparate milieus. Despite the frustrating opacity of the archive, which I can perhaps get into in the Q&A, what has survived shows the remarkable connectivity, visibility, and organizational depth of the effectively invisible Salmacis Society. But I still haven't defined what a male lesbian is. You probably figured it out though. The idea of the male lesbian is one imbricated in trans feminist valuations of the supposedly male-sexed body, a woman, or at least femme-identified gender, and a sexuality, seemingly equally informed by perhaps an idealized view of lesbian second-wave feminist love. Though not all trans femme members use the term male lesbian, and it decreased in use over the 1970s in societal publications, it never completely disappeared. An enduring trans feminine feminist theorization around the term provided a fascinating example of non-academic trans feminine feminist mid-century theorization on gender, sexuality, and liberal individualistic feminism. Seen here is the aforementioned widely distributed 1972 flyer by Douglas. So I'll draw your attention to the different spellings of femme, with the 1M indexing what we would now call cis lesbians and 2M femmes, trans lesbians. In the flyer's glossary, Douglas further defines femme, 2Ms, as, quote, a girl who feels feminine, as contrasted with one who feels masculine. A girl who enjoys the look and feel of long hair, cosmetic makeup, and feminine apparel. A girl who prefers the affectionate, non-aggressive role. A male girl, end quote. This 1972 definition anticipates queer scholastic conceptualizations of femme as a somatic self-stylization that corresponds to one's subjectivity by well over a decade. In its early years, Salmacis had described itself as a femme, 1M, femme, 2M social organization. The group perhaps drew femme, 1M, from the butch femme working class and bar culture of the 1940s and 1950s. At a time in the 1970s when some, but not all, white middle-class feminists critiqued butch femme dynamics for aping heterosexuality, Salmacis refused, nominally at least, the classist and femme-phobic logics of such an imperative. Over time, as the group perhaps cared less about the trans-non-trans distinction, Salmacis literature stopped its use of femme, 1M, in favor of femme, 2Ms, as an umbrella term for all feminine-identified people. While much of the women's movement moved through various positions on politically correct sexuality, for Salmacis it is precisely from desire that politics follows. Feminism is constituted as and through desire and embracing femininity. Far from an expression of patriarchal conditioning, femininity is precisely what feminism looked like for members. 6 years after this 1972 glossary, in a 1978 article for Gay Community News, Douglas chastises the gay and bi movements for their focus on, quote, the question of who we are having sex with, as if this could be separated from who we are having sex as, end quote. In this letter's broader lamentation over society and the counterculture's lack of understanding on sexuality, gender expression, and the sexed body, Douglas explains that, quote, the real question should be, am I a masculine female or a feminine female, or even a middle ground female? As she further contends that, quote, until one comes to grips with this kind of question, there is no hope for the kind of self-knowledge needed in order to even begin to understand one's sexual orientation, end quote. So in such theorizations, Douglas challenges cis-normative gender binaries, which uphold heteronormative ideas of sexuality. If gender cannot be neatly contained and separated from all the other aspects of oneself, especially who and how one desires and has sex, then reckoning with gender involves, to quote Susan Stryker decades later, the realization transgender phenomena constitutes an axis of difference that cannot be subsumed into an object choice model of anti-heteronormativity, end quote. The very existence of male lesbian discourses further challenges historicizations of lesbian feminism, according to which the tradition, in Biddy Martin's words, quote, throw out the baby of erotic and gendered specificities along with the bathwater of limiting and polarized sex roles, end quote. Those besides Douglas earnestly took up theorizing this utopic notion of male lesbianism. In 1976, one-time male lesbian Greg Turner described how they understood this ideal, end quote. The emphasis on emotions without everything being orgasm and sex, as in male homosexuality, was something for me to identify with. Women loving women, sisterhood, and putting energy into other women to overcome sexism and to improve personal relationships has no counterparts in male homosexualism, end quote. In 1979, a trans femme named Kathy described why she loved male lesbians. She writes, quote, I consider myself to be bisexually towards oriented, and as a male woman, I prefer male lesbians to homosexuality. from a man who loves me as a woman. A woman, I found, has a much greater capacity to give and receive love and affection, end quote. I think these expressions deserve to be taken at face value, as reflective of the deeply felt and meaningful, even if unduly idealistically utopian, difference in experiences that came from being loved as a woman by a woman. Robert's comments in particular represent an early articulation of T for T relationalities, longings, and desires, as well as, nuance, a reification and gender essentialist hagiographic view of lesbian sexuality. And where did I find these quotes? Kathy, from 1979, wrote into the Journal of Male Feminism, a feminist trans-feminine periodical, and Greg, in 1976, wrote into the Gay Liberator. Across so many allegedly discrete worlds, we find traces of Salmacis, male lesbian, and Douglas. The sheer numbers of fingers and pies makes it all the more striking the failed or unrealized linkages between Salmacis and the gay trans femme street queens. Salmacis' heart was in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is the same city, at roughly the same time, that had a thriving community of trans feminine street-based sex workers who lived and loved in the city's Tenderloin district. Now immortalized by Susan Stryker's Screaming Queens and a robust number of academic texts, mid-century San Francisco contained a robust and politically engaged assemblage of trans feminine street-based sex workers who included trans women, hair fairies, drag, street, hormone queens, and other avowedly trans feminine persons who often were part of, or otherwise socialized with, or understood themselves as part of, gay, effeminate, and trans feminine social worlds. They had sex with men for money or pleasure. They engaged in spontaneous political actions, like the now often celebrated 1966 Compton's Cafeteria Riot, and many were members of the economically radical gay liberationist group Vanguard, and its eventual successor, the San Francisco Gay Liberation Front. Though Vanguard dissolved before the formation of Salmacis, its former members remained in the area. And the fact that Vanguard members joined its successor group, the SFGLF, could lead one to presume that they influenced Salmacis. Yet the archive is silent. Given the lack of sources, this conclusion, like so many others, can only be partial, like much else in trans history. But it is difficult to detect the influence of street queens within Salmacis. It is plausible that perhaps some of the gay-identified trans femmes of the Tenderloin joined Salmacis chapters, but the overall lack of sources around membership makes it effectively impossible to plausibly demonstrate any cross-pollination. The imbrications of class with sexuality further incline myself, to presume a contingent lack of engagement. In a 1967 issue of Vanguard's eponymous newsletter, an author notes that the main difference between the middle-class homophile group, the Society for Individual Rights, SIR, and their own, Vanguard, is that, quote, Vanguard's people are basically concerned with the essentials. SIR members reflect a more financially secure crowd, end quote. Given the seemingly middle-class nature of Salmacis members, in contrast to the working-class nature of the Queens of the Tenderloin, it is likely the latter lacked both the economic resources to engage with Salmacis' paid events, in addition to a desire to avoid classist chauvinism. Yet the strongest indicator of the absence of street queens comes from the content, or more accurately lack of content, in Salmacis' political texts. Across decades, Salmacis' affiliated authors articulated a novel feminist program, but one that centered an ultimately liberal individualistic politic that seemingly never mentioned any economic issues, much less the precarious destitution often faced by street queens. Indeed, despite the lustful prose and invocation of sex worker aesthetics and figures like courtesans in organizational texts, seemingly none of Salmacis' literature makes any references of the amelioration of sex workers' precarity, decriminalization, or any acknowledgement of sex work as labor. Douglas authored publications like the later Gemini Social Register and elsewhere do include ads for sex workers, primarily dominatrixes, which can perhaps be interpreted as a certain level of assumed support, but this seemingly did not ever manifest in any published acknowledgement of the conditions of deprivation faced by the overwhelming majority of trans feminine people in the 20th century. Perhaps there were Salmacis sources, which spoke to sex workers' rights. Like countless other topics in trans history, they cry out for additional research. But, as in the case of the source base for Salmacis, much remains opaque. At minimum, some people responded to Sally Douglas's ideas, they identified with the term male lesbian or its politics, they attended Salmacis meetings and parties, they treated it as a credible trans-feminist organization. With all this being said, we should not get ahead of ourselves. Though an important rejoinder to totalizing narratives of the second wave, Salmacis' heyday was seemingly contained within the 1970s, though we can trace its existence into the early 2000s. And yet, the history of Salmacis is important for histories of trans femininity, radical feminism, and the wider 1970s. Salmacis and the male lesbian make us feel a little less certain of what we think we know about the past. Though effectively absent from collective memory and much of the available archive, when we consider the brief popularity of Salmacis and the male lesbian, we get different answers to both what second wave feminism was and perhaps where we can go from here. Thank you.
So I want to thank everybody for attending and for your support. I just want you to remember we've got other events coming. Stay in touch with us on our newsletter. If you haven't signed up, there's a place to sign up here or online. And we have all the social media. Well, maybe not all of it. We're not on TikTok, but we're on a lot of the social media. So stay in touch with us through social media. And if you like what we do, we're always looking for help and support. Most people seem to think that we are an endowed chair, but we are not. We rely on support from people like you. And if you have wealthy friends, please encourage them. We're always looking for donations and support for the work that we do. Once again, thank you to everybody who's attended, and a special thank you to Aino. So thank you all.